You know what it was like to date in the Middle Ages? Did you know that your parents pretty much picked your partner for you? Did you know that a casual touch could ruin a lady's future? Number 11. The sacred seal of parental approval. Back in the medieval world, love was often a secondary concern, a happy accident if it occurred at all, rather than the driving force behind a union. The notion of finding your soulmate, or the one, was practically non-existent, a whimsical idea belonging more to the realm of poets and troubadours than to the practicalities of daily life. For young people, especially those of noble birth or substantial property, marriage was first and foremost a strategic alliance, a carefully negotiated contract between families. It was an economic transaction, a political maneuver, and a way to secure lineage and legacy. Your parents, particularly your father, held absolute sway over your marital destiny. Their word was law, and their decision was final. This wasn't just a strong suggestion or a family preference. It was an unbreakable societal norm, reinforced by generations of tradition and the very structure of the feudal system. For a lord, marrying off a daughter meant forging a new bond with another powerful family, perhaps securing a new stretch of land, gaining military support, or ending a long-standing feud. For a wealthy merchant, it meant expanding trade networks and consolidating economic power. Even for peasants, a marriage, though less about grand political schemes, was still about practical considerations, combining two plots of land, ensuring enough hands for the harvest, or forming a helpful alliance with a neighboring family. The idea that a young man or woman might simply choose a partner based on personal attraction or affection was frankly seen as naive and irresponsible, could disrupt the delicate balance of power, undermine family authority, and even lead to severe social instability. Let's consider the nobility. A noble daughter, perhaps no older than 12 or 13, might find herself betrothed to a man twice her age, sight unseen, simply because his father controlled a strategic castle or possessed a large tract of fertile land. The marriage negotiations often began years before the actual ceremony, with emissaries traveling between estates, haggling over dowries, future inheritance, and even the number of nights the groom's family would provide in times of war. The young woman herself had very little, if any, say in the matter. Her duty was to obey, to enter into the union, and to produce heirs, particularly male heirs to continue the family name and secure the future. Refusal was not an option without facing severe consequences, including disinheritance, forced monastic life, or complete social ostracization. Historical chronicles, such as the Gesta Francorum, reveal countless examples of such political marriages, where individuals were merely pawns in a larger game of power. The process of securing parental approval was elaborate and formal. A suitor, or more likely his father, would send an official delegation to the desired bride's family. This delegation would typically include trusted advisors, perhaps a priest, and scribes to draft preliminary agreements. The initial meeting would be less about personal introductions and more about the exchange of family histories, property deeds, and financial statements. The bride's family would scrutinize the suitor's lineage, his family's reputation, their wealth, and their potential for alliances. They would assess his health and his character, but often through proxies and reports, not necessarily through direct interaction with the young man himself. The discussions could last for weeks, sometimes months, involving detailed negotiations over the dowry, the dower, the portion of the husband's property set aside for his wife's support in widowhood, and the rights of any future children. Customs of Beauvais, a collection of legal practices from 13th century France, outlines the meticulous detail involved in such agreements, underscoring their legal and economic significance. Even among the burgeoning merchant class in towns and cities, parental consent was crucial. A merchant family might seek to marry their daughter to the son of another successful merchant to expand their trade routes or consolidate their financial holdings. The dowry here might consist of ready cash, valuable goods, or shares in a profitable venture. Parents would carefully vet the prospective groom's business acumen, his work ethic, and his family's creditworthiness. Personal affection was secondary to financial stability and future prosperity. A young man, even if he desired a particular woman, would first have to secure his own parents' blessing and then approach her family with a formal proposal, often mediated by a trusted elder or a mutual acquaintance. To bypass these steps was to invite scandal and potentially ruin both families' reputations. For the vast majority, the peasantry, marriage was still a practical affair, though with slightly more latitude for personal choice. Peasant family might encourage a match with a neighbor whose plot of land bordered theirs, making farming more efficient, or with a family that had a surplus of livestock. While romantic love might occasionally blossom, it was still subservient to the need for survival and communal well-being. A young man might court a young woman in a village, but he would still need to gain the consent of both sets of parents, usually by demonstrating his ability to work hard, provide for a family, and contribute to the village community. Disobedience could lead to being disinherited, a dire prospect for anyone whose entire livelihood depended on access to land. The social structure of the manor, as described in texts like the Domesday Book, revealed the intricate web of relationships and obligations that governed peasant life, where even small decisions like marriage had broader implications for the community. The overall message was clear. Your parents knew best, and their judgment was final. Any attempt to defy this fundamental rule was seen as a grave act of rebellion, with consequences that could ripple through your entire life and the lives of those connected to you. Number 10. Chaperones. Your ever-present third wheel. Privacy, as you understand it today, was a luxury rarely afforded to young, unmarried individuals in the medieval period, especially if they belonged to the nobility or the burgeoning merchant class. When it came to any sort of interaction between a man and a woman who were not closely related and already married, a third party, a chaperone, was not just a suggestion but an absolute requirement. This was not merely a polite custom, it was a fundamental pillar of social conduct, a protective measure, and a vigilant guardian of reputation, particularly for the woman. The stakes were incredibly high. A woman's honor, and by extension her family's standing, could be irrevocably tarnished by even the slightest hint of impropriety. A shadow of scandal that could destroy all future marriage prospects. So, who were these ever-present guardians? They could be an older female relative, such as an aunt, a grandmother, or even a nursemaid who had been with the family for years. Sometimes it was a trusted servant, a lady-in-waiting, or a member of the household staff. In certain formal situations, especially those involving religious figures, a priest or a monk might act as a chaperone, lending an air of unimpeachable piety to the proceedings. Their role was not just to sit there and look stern. They were active observers, listening to every word, noting every gesture, and ensuring that the conversation remained appropriate and decorous. They were the living embodiment of societal expectations, a constant reminder that all interactions were subject to scrutiny. Imagine a scene. A young noblewoman, perhaps Lady Isolde, finds herself in the presence of a prospective suitor, Sir Gareth. This meeting would almost certainly take place in a public area of the castle, like the Great Hall or a well-frequented garden. Lady Isolde would not be alone. At her side would be her elderly duenna, a woman who had served her family for decades, her eyes missing nothing. Sir Gareth might attempt a compliment or a witty remark, but every syllable would be weighed by the watchful chaperone. Their conversation would be light, perhaps discussing the weather, a recent tournament, or a piece of needlework. Personal topics, any hint of flirtation or expressions of romantic interest would be strictly off-limits. If Sir Gareth dared to suggest a private walk in the moonlit gardens, the duenna's stern glance alone would be enough to halt the thought. The Book of the Knight of La Tour Landry, A 14th century conduct book for young women explicitly warns against solitary meetings, stressing that a woman's reputation is her most precious possession, easily lost through indiscreet behavior. The rationale behind such strict chaperoning was deeply rooted in the medieval social fabric. Virginity for unmarried women was paramount, not just as a moral virtue, but as a critical economic asset. A bride's virginity was a guarantee of legitimate heirs, a sign of her purity, and a testament to her family's honor. Any suspicion of premarital intimacy, even just the appearance of it, could lead to a woman being considered spoiled and therefore unmarriageable. This would bring immense shame upon her family, potentially ruining their standing and prospects. Chaperones were thus the fil-up and defense against such ruin, ensuring that no opportunity arose for compromising situations. They were the physical embodiment of the societal watchfulness that surrounded every interaction. Even in slightly less formal settings, such as village gatherings or communal feasts, young men and women were expected to maintain a certain distance. While they might engage in group dances or communal games, direct, private conversations were rare and would quickly draw the attention of elders or community leaders. Gossip was a powerful force in medieval society, and even a fleeting moment of unsupervised conversation between a man and a woman could spark rumors that would spread like wildfire through the village, damaging reputations with astonishing speed. The Liber de Diversis Medicinis, an anonymous 14th century medical text, indirectly highlights this social pressure by discussing the melancholy of unmarried women, a condition often attributed to prolonged spinsterhood, itself a consequence of a tarnished reputation. Instances of unchaperoned meetings were almost always considered scandalous, leading to severe consequences. If a young noble couple was found to have met in secret, even if no physical intimacy occurred, the girl's reputation would be severely compromised. Her family might struggle to find her a suitable husband, or she might be married off to a less desirable match to contain the scandal. The young man, too, might face social censure, as his actions would be seen as disrespectful and dishonorable. In extreme cases, elopements, where a couple ran away to marry without parental and chaperone consent, were considered a grave defiance of societal norms, often leading to disinheritance, ostracization, and even legal prosecution. Such elopements are recounted in historical accounts, like those surrounding Eleanor of Aquitaine's family, though usually ending with dire consequences for the offending parties. Presence of a chaperone was not just a suggestion, it was an unwritten yet ironclad rule designed to maintain social order, protect family honor, and ensure the purity of lineage, particularly for women, in a world where a good reputation was quite literally worth more than gold. Your chaperone was not just there to watch you. They were there to guard your future. Number 9. Dress to impress and to signal your status. In the medieval world, your clothing was far more than just a means to cover your body or a reflection of your personal taste. It was a powerful, unspoken language, a visual declaration of who you were, where you stood in the rigid social hierarchy, and even your marital status. You didn't just dress to impress. You dressed to inform, to signal, and to conform. Every stitch, every fold, every choice of fabric and color was loaded with meaning, meticulously regulated by both tradition and often by actual laws. These were known as sumptuary laws, and they dictated who could wear what, preventing commoners from dressing above their station and maintaining a clear visual distinction between the classes. For the nobility, clothing was an extravagant display of wealth and power. Imagine a grand lady at court, perhaps Eleanor of Aquitaine, adorned in a gown of shimmering silk dyed with expensive pigments like Tyrian purple, derived from rare sea snails, or rich cochineal red. Her sleeves might be long and flowing, lined with ermine or sable fur, signifying immense luxury and her high standing. The fabric itself, perhaps imported from Byzantium or the Far East, was a statement of global connection and immense personal fortune. Her head would be covered perhaps by an elaborate wimple and veil, adorned with jewels or fine embroidery, marking her as a respectable married woman. A nobleman might wear a tunic of fine wool or velvet, cinched with an ornate belt, and a mantle fastened with a jewel brooch. His hose would be tightly fitted, showing off his legs, and his shoes pointed, reflecting the latest fashion. The very cut and volume of their clothing, using generous amounts of expensive fabric, further emphasized their ability to afford such luxury. The sumptuary law of Edward III in 1363, for example, strictly forbade commoners from wearing gold, silver, silk, or costly furs, making it clear that luxury was reserved for the elite. Middle-class townspeople, like prosperous merchants and skilled artisans, would dress more modestly, but still with a clear eye on status. They might wear good quality woolens, perhaps dyed in solid, less extravagant colors, or with subtle patterns. A merchant's wife might wear a sensible kirtle, a long dress, and a simple veil, but her fabric would be sturdier, perhaps her cloak lined with less expensive fur like rabbit. Their clothes would be well made, clean, and practical, reflecting their industrious nature and their rising economic standing. While they couldn't ape the nobility, they certainly didn't want to be mistaken for peasants. Their appearance was a testament to their hard work and growing prosperity, signaling that they were respectable members of the community, worthy of good matches for their children. Peasants, who formed the vast majority of the population, wore clothes that were durable, functional, and easily repairable. Their garments were typically made from coarse wool or homespun linen, undyed or dyed with natural pigments derived from plants, resulting in earthy tones of brown, green, or undyed gray. Peasant man might wear a simple tunic, breeches, and a rough cloak, while a woman would wear a kirtle and perhaps a simple head covering like a coif or a kerchief. Any embellishment was rare, and their clothes were often patched and worn. Their appearance was a direct reflection of their demanding lives and their place at the bottom of the social ladder. No peasant would ever dream of wearing silk or fur. Not only would it be unthinkable socially, but it would also be incredibly impractical for manual labor. The vision of Piers Plowman, a 14th century allegorical poem, vividly describes the simple utilitarian clothing of the common folk, emphasizing their connection to the land and their labor, beyond social class. Clothing also communicated marital status, especially for women. An unmarried noblewoman might wear her hair uncovered or in elaborate braids, sometimes adorned with ribbons or simple wreaths, allowing her youth and beauty to be more openly displayed. Once married, however, a woman was almost always expected to cover her hair, often with a wimple and veil, a symbol of modesty, piety, and her new status as a respectable wife. This custom was not just a social norm, but was also encouraged by the church, emphasizing the sanctity of marriage and the wife's submission. A widow would adopt specific clothing, often somber black or dark colors, and a distinct wimple that covered her entire head and neck, signaling her mourning and her changed status within society. Even the colors one wore could send messages. Blue was often associated with fidelity and truth, while green might suggest love or new beginnings. In the intricate dance of medieval courtship, your attire was your first introduction, a silent herald of your background, your wealth, and your eligibility. It was a non-negotiable aspect of social interaction, one that you dared not break, because to do so was to fundamentally misunderstand and disregard the very order of the world around you, potentially inviting ridicule, censure, or even legal punishment. The visual language of dress was as important, if not more so, than any spoken word, dictating who you could approach, who might consider you, and how you were perceived in every facet of your medieval life. Number 8. Reputation. Is gold especially for women? In the rigid social structures of the Middle Ages, your reputation was not merely a matter of personal pride. It was a tangible asset, a form of social currency that could make or break your future, particularly if you were a woman. Think of it as a personal credit score. But instead of financial data, it tracked your honor, your virtue, and your adherence to societal norms. One misstep, one whisper of scandal, one seemingly innocent indiscretion could shatter your prospects, leaving you socially ostracized and without hope for a respectable future. This was especially true for women, whose reputation was inextricably linked to their purity and modesty. For an unmarried woman, her virginity and her untarnished reputation were her most valuable possessions. They were the primary assets she brought to a marriage, a guarantee of legitimate heirs for her future husband, and a testament to her family's honor. Any rumor of impropriety, any suspicion of a secret meeting, or any perceived lack of modesty could severely damage her chances of securing a good match. A woman accused of being loose or dishonorable might find herself completely unmarriageable, forced into a convent, or relegated to a life of spinsterhood and social isolation. This wasn't just a social consequence. It had profound economic implications, as marriage was the primary path to financial security and social standing for women. The medieval conduct book, The Good Wife Taught Her Daughter, repeatedly emphasizes the importance of maintaining a spotless reputation through modest behavior and strict adherence to social decorum. Gossip, fueled by limited entertainment and close-knit communities, was a powerful and often destructive force. A single ill-placed word or misinterpreted glance could snowball into a widespread rumor, spreading like wildfire through a village or a noble court. Imagine a young woman, perhaps attending a local fair, caught laughing too boisterously with a group of young men. While seemingly harmless by modern standards, in the medieval context, this could be interpreted as a sign of wantonness or lack of proper decorum, leading to whispers and damaging her standing. These whispers would be repeated, exaggerated, and quickly transform into accepted truth. Regardless of the actual facts, the consequences could be devastating for noblewomen. The stakes were even higher. Their reputations were tied not only to their personal honor, but also to the political and social standing of their entire family. Compromised daughter could undermine a carefully planned alliance, or bring shame upon a proud lineage. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart often recount the importance of noblewomen's reputation in courtly circles, where a stain on one's honor could lead to a loss of favor, political isolation, and a significant drop in social standing. For example, if a lady was perceived to be too receptive to the advances of a courtly lover, even if it was within the bounds of idealized courtly love poetry, it could still invite censure and suspicion from powerful figures who saw it as a threat to marital stability. Men also had their reputations to uphold, though the standards were different. A man's honor was typically linked to his courage in battle, his loyalty to his lord, his generosity, and his ability to provide for his family. A man who was perceived as a coward, a traitor, or a dissolute wastrel would find it difficult to gain respect, secure patronage, or make a good marriage. However, a man's reputation was far less easily damaged by sexual indiscretions than a woman's. While promiscuity might be frowned upon, it rarely carried the same devastating social and economic consequences for a man as it did for a woman. The Assizes of Jerusalem. A legal code from the Crusader states discusses the legal implications of a man's honor in matters of land and military service, but is far less concerned with his sexual conduct compared to a woman's. Pressure to maintain a spotless reputation influenced every aspect of a woman's life, from how she dressed and carried herself to who she spoke to and where she went. She was expected to be modest, demure, and chaste, her actions constantly under the scrutiny of family, neighbors, and the church. Any public display of anger, any flirtatious glance, any moment of perceived disobedience to her elders could be interpreted as a character flaw that would make her less desirable as a wife. Consequences of a ruined reputation were not just social. They could be deeply personal and psychologically crushing, as a woman might feel she had failed her family and forfeited her only path to a respectable life. In a world where your standing was visibly tied to your honor, a good reputation was not just gold, it was the very foundation of your existence. Number 7. Courtly love, the fantasy versus the reality. If you've ever delved into medieval literature, you've probably encountered the enchanting, often heartbreaking concept of courtly love. It's the stuff of legends, valiant knights performing heroic deeds for unattainable ladies, secret glances, exchanged tokens, and passionate declarations in verse. But here's the crucial thing you dared not break. Courtly love was almost entirely a literary and poetic construct, a sophisticated game played in noble courts, and it bore little to no resemblance to the practical, often brutal, realities of medieval marriage. Confusing the two could lead to serious misunderstandings, social censure, and even danger. Courtly love, as articulated by poets like Chrétien de Troyes, and later defined by Andreas Capellanus in his Art of Courtly Love, had a very specific set of rules. It was almost always unconsummated, meaning no physical intimacy beyond perhaps a kiss or a chaste embrace. It was often secret, existing between a knight and a lady who was usually of higher social standing, and crucially, often already married to someone else. The love was idealized, passionate, and based on admiration of the lady's virtue and beauty. The knight served his lady performing feats of chivalry, writing poetry, and suffering pangs of longing, all to gain her favor and a symbolic gesture of her affection. This was a refined aristocratic pastime, a way for bored nobility to engage in intellectual and emotional games within the confines of strict social etiquette. It was a sophisticated form of literary role play. Imagine a young knight, Sir Lancelot, passionately devoted to Queen Guinevere, the wife of his king Arthur. Their love, in the tales, is a complex dance of loyalty and forbidden desire. Lancelot risks everything for Guinevere, not for physical gain, but for her esteem, her mercy, or favor. He performs incredible acts of bravery in tournaments, wears her favor, a scarf or ribbon, into battle, and dedicates his triumphs to her. Their relationship is characterized by intense emotional connection, longing, and spiritual elevation. But crucially, it is often portrayed as platonic, at least in its idealized form. When it does become physical, as it notoriously does in some versions of the Arthurian legends, it leads to the downfall of the kingdom, a stark reminder that crossing the line from idealized fantasy to physical reality had dire consequences. The art of courtly love even goes so far as to claim that true love cannot exist between spouses, because marriage is a duty and a contract, while true love must be freely given. Now contrast this with the reality of medieval marriage. As we've already discussed, marriages were primarily arranged for economic, political, or social reasons. They were contracts, alliances between families, designed to secure land, wealth, and heirs. Love was a bonus, not a prerequisite. A husband and wife were expected to fulfill their duties. The husband to provide and protect, the wife to manage the household and produce children. Affection might grow over time, born of shared responsibilities and mutual respect, but it was rarely the initial spark. A husband in this practical world would likely view his wife as a partner in a joint enterprise, not as an unattainable muse to be worshipped from afar. The legal documents surrounding marriage contracts, like those recorded in the close rolls of England, meticulously detail property transfers and financial agreements with no mention of romantic affection. The danger of mistaking courtly love for real-world pursuit was immense. If a knight genuinely tried to pursue a married lady with the intent of physical intimacy, it was not seen as romantic, but as a grave dishonor to her husband, a violation of feudal loyalty, and a sin against the church. could lead to accusations of adultery, which carried severe penalties, including imprisonment, disfigurement, or even death, particularly for the woman involved. For a single woman, if she encouraged a courtly love scenario with a married man, or if she was perceived to be too forward in a similar vein, her reputation could be ruined, making her unmarriageable. The Book of the Knight of La Tour Landry cautions young women against receiving gifts or favors from men that could be misinterpreted as signs of an illicit relationship, emphasizing the importance of maintaining an impeccable reputation. So, while the tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde might have entertained and inspired, they were not blueprints for romantic interaction in the real world. They were an escape, a way to explore complex emotions and chivalric ideals in a fictional setting. To ignore the stark line between this idealized literary construct and the pragmatic reality of medieval life was to invite social ostracization, severe punishment, or even ruin. Courtly love was a beautiful, dangerous fantasy, and daring to bring its rules into the stark light of everyday life was a mistake few could afford to make. Number 6. The dowry, your ticket to the altar. In the medieval world, especially for women, a dowry was not just a nice bonus. It was often the non-negotiable price of admission to marriage. It was a significant financial contribution from the bride's family to the groom or his family, and it played a pivotal role in securing a suitable match. Without a dowry, a woman's prospects for marriage were severely limited, if not entirely extinguished, regardless of her beauty, charm, or character. This was a system rooted in economic realities, a clear demonstration that marriage was as much a business transaction as it was a personal union. So what exactly was a dowry? It wasn't always a lump sum of gold coins, although it certainly could be for very wealthy families. A dowry could consist of land, livestock, valuable goods, jewels, fine clothing, household furnishings, or even promises of future inheritance. For a noble family, a dowry might include an entire manor, complete with its peasants and revenues, or a significant sum of money. For a merchant family, it could be a share in a lucrative trade venture, a collection of valuable textiles, or a substantial amount of ready cash. For a peasant family, a dowry might be a few head of cattle, some household tools, a valuable piece of fabric, or the right to work a specific plot of land. The Domesday Book, while primarily a record of land ownership, occasionally gives glimpses into the transfer of resources related to marriage, hinting at the economic underpinnings of these unions. The purpose of the dowry was multifaceted. Primarily, it was intended to support the wife within her new marriage, providing her with a measure of financial security and contributing to the establishment of the new household. It was also a way for the bride's family to provide for her future, especially in an era where women had limited means of independent income. In some legal systems, the dowry technically remained the wife's property, managed by her husband, but revertible to her or her family in the event of his death, divorce, or annulment. This provided a crucial safeguard for women, ensuring they would not be left destitute. The Magna Carta of 1215 even touches upon the rights of widows to their dower, a separate provision from the husband's property, often related to the dowry, highlighting the legal importance of marital financial arrangements. Negotiations over the dowry were a complex and often protracted affair, involving agents, lawyers, and sometimes even royal intermediaries. It was a formal process where both families sought to secure the best possible terms for their respective children. The groom's family would assess the value of the dowry against the prestige, lineage, or connections of the bride's family. A larger dowry might compensate for a less prestigious lineage, while a smaller dowry might be accepted if the bride came from an exceptionally powerful or well-connected family. These negotiations could often drag on for months, filled with intricate clauses, conditions, and guarantees, as meticulously detailed in medieval marriage contracts preserved in various archives across Europe. For example, the marriage contract between Margaret of England and King Alexander III of Scotland in the 13th century specified a dowry of 10,000 marks, a truly enormous sum, highlighting the scale of such transactions among royalty. The absence of a sufficient dowry was a major impediment to marriage. A woman from a respectable family, but without adequate financial means, would find it incredibly difficult to attract a suitable husband. Even if she was beautiful and virtuous, her lack of a dowry would make her a financial burden rather than an asset. Such women might be forced to enter convents, become household servants, or remain single, often living in straitened circumstances. Conversely, a large dowry could elevate a woman's marriage prospects significantly, allowing her to marry into a higher social stratum or secure a more desirable partner than she might otherwise have been able to. The story of many medieval women, particularly those of noble birth, who were sent to convents, often stemmed from their family's inability to provide a suitable dowry for them to marry into a politically advantageous family. The Annals Cambriae, Welsh annals, sometimes lament the lack of appropriate dowries for noble daughters, noting the resulting difficulties in securing alliances. In essence, the dowry was a fundamental component of the medieval marriage market. It was a tangible expression of a woman's worth, not in a personal sense, but in an economic one, and it was a critical factor in determining her future security and social standing. To disregard the importance of the dowry, or to attempt a marriage without one, was to defy the very economic logic upon which medieval society, and especially its marital customs, were built. It was a prerequisite, a ticket that you simply dared not break if you hoped to walk down the aisle. Number 5. Betrothal. More than just a promise. In the medieval world, the period of betrothal was not a casual engagement, like a modern-day proposal, a romantic gesture that could be easily broken off if things didn't work out. Far from it. A betrothal, known as sponsalia in canon law, was a deeply serious, legally binding contract, almost as weighty as the marriage itself. Was a public declaration of intent to marry, often accompanied by formal ceremonies and exchanges of tokens, and breaking it without very specific legally recognized reasons was a serious offense with significant repercussion. The process of betrothal was highly formalized, particularly for those of higher social standing. It typically began after the families had thoroughly negotiated the marriage contract, including the dowry and other financial agreements. The betrothal ceremony itself might involve a public declaration of consent from both the bride and the groom, often in the presence of witnesses, including family members, community leaders, and sometimes a priest. There might be an exchange of rings, not necessarily for the finger, but perhaps as a token of the agreement or other symbolic gifts. A common practice was the hand fasting, where the couple literally joined hands, signifying their commitment to one another. The Book of the Knight of La Tour Landry advises young women on the solemnity of such promises and the importance of respecting them. Once a betrothal was formally established, it carried immense legal and social weight. Under canon law, a betrothal was considered a form of verba de futuro, words concerning the future, meaning a promise to marry at a later date. However, if this promise was accompanied by verba de praesenti, words concerning the present, such as, "I take you as my husband-wife now," it could even be considered a valid, albeit unsolemnized, marriage in the eyes of the Church. This subtle distinction was incredibly important and could lead to complex legal disputes. For instance, if a couple exchanged vows of present consent privately, even without witnesses, and then later had sexual intercourse, the Church might consider them already married, making it difficult for either party to subsequently marry someone else. This was a common source of conflict and legal wrangling in medieval ecclesiastical courts. Breaking a betrothal was not a simple matter. It required a valid legal reason, such as the discovery of a pre-existing marriage, a previously unknown familial relationship within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity or affinity, too closely related by blood or marriage, or a serious physical impediment like impotence. If a betrothal was broken without such grounds, the offending party could face legal penalties, including financial compensation to the wronged party, or even spiritual penalties from the church. The shame and social censure associated with breaking a betrothal were also significant, potentially damaging the reputation of the party who initiated the break, making it harder for them to secure another match. Records from episcopal courts, like those found in the York Cause Papers, reveal numerous cases of betrothal disputes, highlighting the legal and social consequences. Period between betrothal and marriage could vary greatly, ranging from a few months to several years, especially if the bride or groom was very young or if complex political alliances needed time to solidify. During this time, the betrothed couple was expected to behave as if they were already married in terms of fidelity and propriety, though not necessarily in terms of cohabitation or physical intimacy. Any sexual relations during this period were considered a grave sin, often carrying the same weight as adultery. For the woman, it was particularly dangerous, as a premarital pregnancy would bring immense shame and ruin her future. The betrothal period served as a time for the family's tafadnal preparations, for the dowry to be delivered, and for the couple to become accustomed to the idea of their impending union. Think of the case of Edward II of England and Isabella of France, betrothed when Isabella was a mere child. The betrothal solidified a powerful political alliance between England and France, and despite the many years that passed before their actual marriage, the commitment was firm and unbreakable from the moment of the initial agreement. Their union, though ultimately disastrous, began with this formal, legally binding promise. In essence, a medieval betrothal was not a mere promise. It was a foundational step in the marital process, a legally and socially binding commitment that solidified the intentions of both families and the individuals involved. To enter into a betrothal was to embark on a path from which retreat was incredibly difficult and often fraught with severe consequences. It was a promise you simply dared not break, for it governed your future and the honor of your lineage. Number 4. Physical touch. Ants. No-go zone, mostly. In the sprawling tapestry of medieval life, where social interactions were meticulously choreographed and public decorum was paramount, the concept of physical touch between unmarried individuals was an incredibly delicate. It was a no-go zone, a boundary you dared not cross, especially in public and particularly for women. Unlike modern dating where casual touching, hand-holding, or even a public kiss might be commonplace expressions of affection, in the Middle Ages, such displays were strictly frowned upon, seen as highly improper, immodest, and potentially ruinous to one's reputation. Society, heavily influenced by the teachings of the Church, placed immense value on chastity before marriage. Any physical contact between a man and a woman who were not married or very closely related was viewed with suspicion, as it could easily lead to sin and compromise. For women, even the slightest perceived impropriety could damage their honor and their future marriage prospects. A good, respectable woman was expected to maintain a reserved demeanor, her body and her affections shielded from public view. Consider the simple act of hand-holding. While a married couple might occasionally hold hands in private or within a very close family setting, for an unmarried couple, even this seemingly innocent gesture could be misinterpreted, could suggest a level of intimacy that was considered inappropriate, hinting at secret meetings or even premarital sexual relations. If a young man dared to take a young woman's hand in public, it would likely draw disapproving stares from elders, and whispers would quickly spread, particularly damaging to the woman's reputation. The Book of the Knight of La Tour Landry, a manual of moral instruction for his daughters, repeatedly warns against any physical familiarity with men, emphasizing the importance of guarding one's body and reputation above all else. Kissing was even more restricted. Kiss, in the medieval context, was a deeply significant gesture. It could be a sign of respect, a kiss on the hand or cheek from a vassal to a lord, a greeting between close family members, or a ceremonial act, such as the kiss exchanged during a betrothal ceremony to seal the agreement. However, a romantic kiss between unmarried individuals in public was virtually unheard of and would be seen as scandalously immodest. It would imply a level of intimacy that was reserved only for the marriage bed, and certainly not for public display. If a couple were caught kissing, especially a passionate kiss, it would be considered undeniable proof of illicit intent, potentially leading to accusations of fornication. The focus in the initial stages of courtship, if one could even call it that in the modern sense, was on polite conversation, exchange of letters or poetic verses, and perhaps symbolic gifts, all conducted under the watchful eye of chaperones. The interaction was meant to be cerebral and spiritual, emphasizing character, lineage, and future prospects rather than physical attraction. The ideal of courtly love, while often passionate in its emotional intensity, was typically chaste in its physical expression, further reinforcing the idea that physical intimacy belonged within the confines of marriage. For a woman, being seen engaging in inappropriate physical contact could mean a ruined reputation, making her unmarriageable and bringing deep shame upon her family. She might be sent to a convent or ostracized by her community. For a man, while the social consequences might be less devastating, he could still be seen as dishonorable, lacking in respect for women, and potentially untrustworthy. More gravely, if physical contact led to premarital pregnancy, the repercussions were dire for both parties, but especially for the woman. She would face public humiliation, potentially losing her place in society, and her child would be born illegitimate, facing a lifetime of social stigma and legal disadvantages. Ecclesiastical court records, such as those from the Diocese of Hereford, frequently document cases of fornication and the accompanying social shame, underscoring the severity of such transgressions. In a society where marriage was a sacrament and virginity was a valuable commodity, any form of premarital physical intimacy was a grave sin against God and a serious transgression against social order. Therefore, when navigating the delicate dance of medieval courtship, keeping your hands to yourself was not merely a suggestion. It was an unspoken law, a rule of decorum that you simply dared not break if you wished to maintain your honor, your reputation, and your future. Number 3. The Church's unblinking eye. In the medieval world, the Church was not just a spiritual guide. It was a pervasive, powerful institution that permeated every aspect of daily life. And nowhere was its influence more profound than in matters of marriage and family. Church's unblinking eye observed, judged, and dictated the rules of engagement, betrothal, and matrimony. Canon law, the body of laws and regulations made by ecclesiastical authority, defined who could marry whom, when, and under what conditions. To defy the Church's decrees in matters of love and marriage was to risk excommunication, social ostracization, and eternal damnation. Marriage, according to the Church, was one of the 7 sacraments, a sacred union ordained by God, indissoluble and binding for life. This divine mandate meant that the Church held ultimate authority over its validity and regulation. One of the most significant rules was the prohibition against marriages within certain degrees of kinship, known as consanguinity, blood relation, and affinity, relation by marriage. Church's rules on this were incredibly strict and often extended to many generations, making it difficult for noble families, whose genealogies were often intertwined, to find suitable partners. For instance, marrying a cousin, even a distant one, could be deemed invalid, and countless annulments were sought on these grounds. The Decretals of Gregory IX, a comprehensive collection of canon law from the 13th century, provides detailed definitions of these prohibited degrees, highlighting the Church's meticulous oversight. Before a marriage could take place, especially a formal one, the church required the banns of marriage to be read. This involved publicly announcing the intention to marry in the parish church for 3 consecutive Sundays or holy days. The purpose of the bans was to allow anyone with knowledge of a lawful impediment, such as a pre-existing marriage, too close a blood relation, or a vow of celibacy, to come forward and state their objection. This acted as a community-based system of checks and balances, ensuring that no unlawful unions occurred. If an impediment was discovered, the marriage could not proceed, or it would be deemed invalid if it already had. Records from medieval parish registers frequently show entries of bans being read, underscoring this widespread practice. The role of the priest was central to the solemnization of marriage. While a valid marriage could technically be formed by the mutual consent of the parties, especially verba de presenti, discussed earlier, a marriage solemnized by a priest in a church was considered the most proper and legitimate. The priest would bless the couple, witness their vows, and oversee the exchange of rings. This public sacred ceremony lent an air of divine approval and community recognition to the union, making it virtually unassailable. The ritual of Sarum, a widely used liturgical manual in medieval England, specifies the rites and prayers for the solemnization of marriage, detailing the priest's role. Annulment was the only way to dissolve a marriage recognized by the church, and it was incredibly difficult to obtain. Unlike a divorce, which dissolves a valid marriage, an annulment declared that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place due to some fundamental impediment present at the time of the vows. Common grounds included non-consummation, lack of sexual intercourse, coercion pre-contract with another party, or the aforementioned kinship prohibitions. The process was lengthy, expensive, and required extensive proof, often involving witnesses and legal battles in ecclesiastical courts. Famous cases, such as that of King Henry VIII's desire for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, illustrate the immense power the Church held in these matters and the difficulty of challenging its rulings. Furthermore, the Church also condemned bigamy, being married to more than one person at a time, as a grave sin, and those found guilty faced severe spiritual and temporal penalties. Fornication, sexual intercourse outside of marriage, and adultery, sexual intercourse between a married person and someone who is not their spouse, were also considered serious sins, punishable by penance, public humiliation, and sometimes even legal consequences, depending on the region and the social standing of the individuals involved. The Church actively campaigned against these practices through sermons, confessional advice, and the threat of divine retribution. The omnipresence of the Church meant that every aspect of courtship and marriage was filtered through a religious lens. From the moment a potential match was considered, through the negotiations and betrothal, to the final ceremony and the lifetime of the union, the Church's rules, doctrines, and moral teachings were the ultimate arbiters. To ignore or defy the Church's unblinking eye was to gamble not only with your earthly reputation and legal standing, but also with your immortal soul. It was a rule that you simply dared not break. Number 2. Social status. The invisible wall. In the intricate, rigidly hierarchical world of the Middle Ages, your social status was not just a label, it was an invisible wall, largely determining your opportunities, your alliances, and crucially, who you could and could not marry. Society was structured like a pyramid, with the monarch at the apex, followed by the high nobility, then lesser lords and knights, the clergy, the burgeoning merchant class, and finally, the vast majority, the peasantry. Marrying someone from a different social stratum was an incredibly rare and often perilous undertaking, almost always viewed with suspicion, if not outright condemnation. You simply dared not break the invisible wall of social status. The feudal system was built upon inherited rank, land ownership, and reciprocal obligations. For the nobility, marriage was a powerful tool for consolidating wealth, expanding territory and securing political alliances. A lord would seek to marry his son to the daughter of another powerful noble, perhaps to gain control of a strategic castle or to form a military pact. Similarly, a noble daughter would be married off to a man of equivalent or higher rank to elevate her family's standing or secure their future. Marrying down was considered disparagement, a serious breach of honor that could result in the loss of land, titles, and social standing. Imagine the outrage if a powerful duke's daughter expressed a desire to marry a simple knight, let alone a peasant. Such a union would be unthinkable, undermining the very concept of lineage and inherited privilege. The Assize of Northampton, 1176. A legal decree by Henry II explicitly discussed the feudal obligations of tenants, reinforcing the importance of maintaining proper social order in marital arrangements. Even among the lesser nobility and knights, status was paramount. A knight might seek to marry the daughter of a wealthy landowner or a minor lord to gain more land or access to resources, but he would rarely, if ever, marry a peasant woman, as this would diminish his own status and potentially disinherit his children from their rightful place in the social hierarchy. Tales of knights falling in love with peasant maidens are almost exclusively found in romantic literature, serving as a delightful fantasy rather than a reflection of social reality. The rise of the merchant class in towns and cities introduced a new dynamic, but the wall still largely held. Wealthy merchants, while often commoners by birth, amassed significant fortunes, allowing them to exert economic influence. They might seek to marry their children to those of other successful merchant families to expand their trade networks. In some rare cases, a wealthy merchant's daughter with a substantial dowry might marry a lesser noble who was in need of funds, but this was a careful calculation and the social disparity would still be keenly felt. The noble family accepting such a match would likely have to justify it by emphasizing the financial gains, implicitly acknowledging the compromise in social standing. Records from medieval guilds and urban charters often show alliances formed through marriage within the merchant class, solidifying their own distinct social fabric. For the vast majority of the population, the peasantry, marriage was largely confined to their own social stratum. Peasants married other peasants, often within their own village or a neighboring one. Their marriages were about combining labor, sharing resources, and ensuring the continuation of their agricultural livelihood. While there might have been slight distinctions between freemen and serfs, the overall expectation was that one married within one's class. Peasant marrying someone from the nobility was simply an impossibility. Their lives were too fundamentally different, their legal rights and obligations too disparate. The invisible wall of social status was reinforced by custom, law, and the economic realities of the day. A marriage outside one's class was not just a personal choice. It was a challenge to the established order, a threat to the very structure of medieval society. Could lead to disinheritance, social ostracism, and the loss of protection and support from one's community or lord. The consequences were too severe to contemplate for most. Your entire life, your identity, and your future were inextricably linked to your birthright and social standing. To disregard this fundamental rule was to invite chaos and ruin, a wall you simply dared not break in your quest for a partner. Number 1. The art of indirect communication. Forget direct messages, blunt confessions of feelings, or even a straightforward, "Do you like me?" circle, yes or no. In the medieval world, the art of communicating romantic interest, particularly in the initial stages of any potential courtship, was a master class in subtlety, symbolism, and elaborate indirection. Overt declarations of affection were rare, often considered crude, immodest, and even aggressive. Instead, individuals, especially men trying to gauge a woman's interest, relied on a complex language of gestures, gifts, intermediaries, and veiled messages. You simply dared not break the unspoken rules of indirect communication. Why, the indirection for women modesty and demureness were paramount virtues. A woman who was too forward, too direct, or too quick to signal interest was seen as immodest, potentially even loose, which could instantly ruin her reputation. For men, being too direct could be perceived as disrespectful, especially if the woman was of higher social standing or if her family was protective. The goal was to test the waters cautiously, to hint at interest without ever explicitly stating it, allowing for an easy retreat if the interest was not reciprocated, thus avoiding personal embarrassment and social scandal. One of the most common forms of indirect communication was the exchange of gifts. A man might send a woman a small, symbolic token, a beautifully crafted piece of jewelry, a finely embroidered glove, a carefully chosen flower, or perhaps a book of poetry. These gifts were not just presents. They were coded messages. Type of gift, its quality, and the manner in which it was delivered all conveyed layers of meaning. A simple posy of flowers might be a gentle inquiry, while a valuable jewel could signify serious intent. The woman's response to the gift was equally indirect. Accepting it graciously might be a sign of polite acknowledgement, while wearing it publicly could be a subtle sign of reciprocal interest. Rejecting it, or sending it back, was a clear and unmistakable no. The Roman de la Rose, a hugely influential 13th century allegorical poem, uses flowers and gardens as elaborate metaphors for love and courtship, reflecting this symbolic language. Poetry and song also served as powerful vehicles for indirect communication. Troubadours and courtly poets would compose elaborate verses praising a lady's beauty, virtue, and grace. These poems, often sung in public, allowed men to express passionate sentiments without directly addressing the object of their affections. The language was often metaphorical, filled with allegories and classical allusions, allowing the poet to speak of love in general terms while conveying specific admiration to a particular listener. A lady might acknowledge such a performance with a slight nod or a gentle smile, signaling her appreciation without committing to anything more. The Lais of Marie de France, 12th century narrative poems, beautifully illustrate these lyrical expressions of love and longing. Intermediaries played a crucial role in bridging the gap between individuals. A trusted servant, a loyal friend, or an older female relative might act as a go-between, carrying messages, sounding out opinions, and gently probing for interest. These intermediaries could relay sentiments, discuss family backgrounds, and even subtly negotiate potential matches without the principals ever having a direct, uncomfortable conversation. This kept personal emotions out of formal discussions and protected the reputations of both parties. Even gestures and glances carried significant weight. A lingering look, a particular tilt of the head, a subtle blush, or a modest lowering of the eyes could all be interpreted as signs of interest or disinterest. These non-verbal cues were carefully observed and meticulously analyzed, part of an unspoken choreography of courtship. For instance, a woman might occasionally meet a man's gaze across a crowded hall, but then immediately look away, indicating a fleeting interest while maintaining her modesty. Too bold a gaze would be seen as inappropriate. The concept of fainting or swooning was also a common, albeit dramatic, form of indirect communication, particularly for women. In medieval literature, women often fainted when overwhelmed by strong emotion, either joy or distress, as a way to express feelings that could not be openly articulated. While perhaps exaggerated in literature, it reflects a society where direct emotional expression was often suppressed, especially for women. Ultimately, the goal of this indirect communication was to create a dance of subtle signals, allowing for a gradual escalation of interest without explicit commitments or uncomfortable rejections. It was a slow, drawn-out process, emphasizing patience, decorum, and the careful navigation of social expectations. To rush this process, to bypass the layers of subtlety, or to directly declare one's affection was to violate the very fabric of medieval courtship. It was a breach of etiquette that you simply dared not break, for it could lead to rejection, embarrassment, and ruin in a world where every public action was meticulously scrutinized.